The second piece of information that defines a given variable is its identifier. Again, identifier is just a very fancy way of saying its name, a way to identify it and separate it from all those other variables that may exist in the program. Now, of course, there's very specific rules when we're naming our variables or giving them an identifier. We have to follow these rules or it could break the system and may not even compile. So what I'm going to go through here is a series of rules and a series of guidelines. The rules must be followed. If you don't follow a rule, it will not compile. However, if you follow all the rules, but you break one or two of the guidelines, the program won't crash and it will compile. The problem lies in the fact that you're kind of not following the standards that exist in most languages that we're trying to follow here. So it's best practices to actually follow both the rules and the guidelines. You'll see what we mean as we go. So let's take a look at all the rules for identifying a variable. First and most important rule is that the name must be unique. Now imagine for a second that math problem we did in the first module for variables, where we said calculate the area of a rectangle given the length and the width of 5 and 3. Now imagine during those let statements we said let L be the length of the rectangle, and then we later on said it has a value 5. And then later on, after that, right after the let L be the length, we say let L be the width. Well, what we've done is we've just created confusion, ambiguity. We just let L be both values. We tried to define the letter L, the variable L, to hold or to represent two different things. Well, that's a problem. We can't do that. You won't know what you're talking about when. So that's the same thing in our variables. The most important rule is that the name of a variable is in fact unique. The next piece is that the name of a variable is made up of letters and numbers. We say that it is alphanumeric. Now there is a few exceptions to this rule, but for simplicity's sake and consistency's sake, we're just going to state that the rule is that your identifier must be made up of only letters and numbers. Rule number 3. Your identifier may contain a number, but it may not start with a number. So it must start with a letter. So for example, I could have an identifier called number 1. This is fine. What I can't have is a variable called one number. That will crash. That will not, no, sorry, it won't crash. The compiler won't allow it. It's not valid. And finally, our last rule that we must follow, no special characters. And that means things like, percent signs, at signs, pound signs, or hashtags, depending on how old you are while you're reading this, asterisks, and things like that. There are a few exceptions to this rule, but we're not going to cover those because I'd rather you just stick to your letters and numbers and be consistent in that approach. So these are our rules. We must follow these or our system won't work, it won't compile at all. The next part is our guidelines. So these are a little bit more specific in terms of structure and standardization across the industry. So our guidelines, just make some little space here. Again, if you don't follow the guidelines, it won't break the program, it won't stop it from compiling, but you are breaking standards, and it could make it very difficult to work with you in your code. So, guideline number 1. The identifier should be short and descriptive of its purpose. Essentially, why does that variable exist? That knowledge should exist in the name of the variable. So for example, I might have a variable called user name. Well, it's very easy to tell what that variable holds. It holds the name of the user. It tells me not only what the data is, but where I got it. That's a very short and descriptive name. So what I would not want to see, so that's allowed, what I would not want to see is a variable called x. That's no good for one specific reason. We have no idea what x represents. There's no way for us to know. So we want to use unique descriptive names that actually are useful. The second guideline, which is probably just as important as the first one, is that all variables should be spelled using Camelcase. Camelcase is a very simple strategy. Whenever you name your variable, the first word is all lowercase, as we see here, user, and every following word after the first word starts with a capital letter. Now, why do you think we do this? Well, we do it for a very specific reason. Our variable names aren't allowed to have spaces, so we have to separate the words in some way. And the way we choose to do this is by capitalizing each second and third and fourth and so on word. This sets a separator in our eye from each word. We go from lowercase to uppercase, and it allows us to understand the name at a very quick pace. So username would be a valid Camelcase identifier. Another one might be something like student number. Now, even if there's more than two words in the name, such as my favorite color, well, that tells me right there that I have two additional words on top of the my favorite color. So these are the identifier conventions, and that's all there is for setting up our data types and our identifiers. We'll move on next month.